The Light of Other Days by Bob Shaw. Read by Anton Rodgers.
Leaving the village behind, we followed the heady sweeps of the road up into a land of slow glass. I'd never seen one of the farms before, and at first found them slightly eerie, an effect heightened by imagination and circumstance. The car's turbine was pulling smoothly and quietly in the damp air, so that we seemed to be carried over the convolutions of the road in a kind of supernatural silence. On our right, the mountains sifted down into a perfect valley of timeless pine, and everywhere stood the great frames of slow glass, drinking light. An occasional flash of afternoon sunlight on their wind bracing created an illusion of movement, but in fact, the frames were deserted. The rows of windows had been standing on the hillside for years, staring into the valley, and men only cleaned them in the middle of the night, when their human presence wouldn't matter to the thirsty glass. They were fascinating, but Selina and I didn't mention the windows. I think we hated each other so much, we both were reluctant to sully anything new by drawing it into the nexus of our emotions. The holiday, I had begun to realize, was a stupid idea in the first place. I had thought it would cure everything, but of course it didn't stop Selina being pregnant, and worse still, it didn't even stop her being angry about being pregnant. Rationalizing our dismay over her condition, we'd circulated the usual statements to the effect that we would have liked having children, but later on, at the proper time. Selina's pregnancy had cost us her well-paid job, and with it the new house we'd been negotiating, and which was far beyond the reach of my income from poetry. But the real source of our annoyance was that we were face to face with the realization that people who say they want children later always mean they want children never. Our nerves were thrumming with the knowledge that we, who'd thought ourselves so unique, had fallen into the same biological trap as every mindless, rotting creature which ever existed. The road took us along the southern slopes of Ben Cruachan, until we began to catch glimpses of the grey Atlantic far ahead. I had just cut our speed to absorb the view better when I noticed the sign spiked to a gatepost. It said, "Slow glass, quality high, prices low. J.R. Hagen." On an impulse, I stopped the car on the verge, wincing slightly as tough grasses whipped noisily at the bodywork. "Why have we stopped?" Selina's neat smoke-silver head turned in surprise. "Well, look at the sign. Let's go up and see what there is. The stuff might be reasonably priced out here." Selina's voice was pitched high with scorn as she refused. But I was too taken with my idea to listen. I had an illogical conviction that doing something extravagant and crazy would set us right again. "Come on," I said. "The exercise might do us some good. We've been driving too long anyway." She shrugged in a way that hurt me and got out of the car. We walked up a path made of irregular packed clay steps, nosed with short lengths of sapling. The path curved through trees which clothed the edge of the hill, and at its end we found a low farmhouse. Beyond the little stone building, tall frames of slow glass gazed out toward the voice-stilling sight of Cruachan's ponderous descent towards the waters of Loch Lynn. Most of the panes were perfectly transparent, but a few were dark, like panels of polished ebony. As we approached the house, through a neat cobbled yard, a tall, middle-aged man in ash-coloured tweeds rose and waved to us. He had been sitting on a low rubble wall which bounded the yard, smoking a pipe and staring toward the house. At the front window of the cottage, a young woman in a tangerine dress stood with a small boy in her arms, but she turned disinterestedly and moved out of sight as we drew near. "Mr. Hagen?" I guessed. "Correct. You come to see some glass, have you? Well, you've come to the right place." Hagen spoke crisply, with traces of the pure Highland accent which sounds so much like Irish to the unaccustomed ear. He had one of those calmly dismayed faces one finds on elderly road menders and philosophers. "Yes," I said, "we're on holiday. We saw your sign." Selina, who usually has a natural fluency with strangers, said nothing. She was looking toward the now empty window with what I thought was a slightly puzzled expression. "Up from London, are you? Well, as I said, you've come to the right place. And at the right time, too. My wife and I don't see many people this early in the season." I laughed. "Does that mean that we might be able to buy a little glass without mortgaging our home?" "Look at that now," Hagen said, smiling helplessly. "I've thrown away any advantage I might have had in the transaction. Rose, that's my wife, says I'll never learn. Still, let's sit down and talk it over." He pointed at the rubble wall, then glanced doubtfully at Selina's immaculate blue skirt. "Wait till I fetch a rug from the house." Hagen limped quickly into the cottage, closing the door behind him. "Perhaps it wasn't such a marvellous idea to come up here," I whispered to Selina. "But you might at least be pleasant to the man. I think I can smell a bargain." "Some hope," she said with deliberate coarseness. "Surely even you must have noticed that ancient dress his wife was wearing. He won't give much away to strangers." "Was that his wife?" "Of course that was his wife." "Well, well," I said, surprised. "Anyway, try to be civil with him. I don't want to be embarrassed." Selina snorted, but she smiled whitely when Hagen reappeared, and I relaxed a little. Strange how a man can love a woman and yet at the same time pray for her to fall under a train. Hagen spread the tartan blanket on the wall and we sat down, feeling slightly self-conscious and having been translated from our city-orientated lives into a rural tableau. On the distant slate of the loch, beyond the watchful frames of sloe glass, a slow-moving steamer drew a white line toward the south. The boisterous mountain air seemed almost to invade our lungs, giving us more oxygen than we required. "Some of the glass farmers round here," Hagen began, "give strangers such as yourselves a sales talk about how beautiful the autumn is in this part of Argyll. Oh, it might be the spring or the winter. I don't do that. Any fool knows that the place that doesn't look right in summer never looks right. What do you say?" I nodded compliantly. "I want you just to take a good look out toward Mull, Mr. Garland. Garland. That's what you're buying if you buy my glass. And it never looks better than it does at this minute. The glass is in perfect phase, none of it less than 10 years thick, and a 4-foot window will cost you £200. "200?" Selina said, shocked. "That's as much as they charge at the Sindar shop in Bond Street." Hagen smiled patiently, then looked closely at me to see if I knew enough about glass to appreciate what he'd been saying. His price had been much higher than I'd hoped, but 10 years thick. The cheap glass one found in places like Vistaplex or Panorama stores usually consisted of 1/4 of an inch of ordinary glass, faced with a veneer of sloe glass, perhaps only 10 or 12 months thick. "You don't understand, darling," I said, already determined to buy. "This glass will last 10 years, and it's in phase. Doesn't that only mean it keeps time?" Hagen smiled at her again, realizing he had no further necessity to bother with me. "Only, you say? Oh, pardon me, Mrs. Garland, but you don't seem to appreciate the miracle, the genuine, honest-to-goodness miracle of engineering precision needed to produce a piece of glass in phase. When I say the glass is 10 years thick, it means it takes light 10 years to pass through it. In effect, each one of those panes is 10 light years thick, more than twice the distance to the nearest star. So a variation in actual thickness of only 1/1,000,000th of an inch would—" He stopped talking for a moment and sat quietly looking towards the house. I turned my head from the view of the loch and saw the young woman standing at the window again. Hagen's eyes were filled with a kind of greedy reverence, which made me feel uncomfortable, and at the same time convinced me Selina had been wrong. In my experience, husbands never looked at wives that way. At least, not at their own. The woman remained in view for a few seconds, dress glowing warmly, then moved back into the room. Suddenly I received a distinct, though inexplicable, impression she was blind. My feeling was that Selina and I were perhaps blundering through an emotional interplay as violent as our own. "I'm sorry," Hagen continued. "I thought Rose was going to call me for something. Now, where was I, Mrs. Garland? 10 light years compressed into a quarter of an inch means—" I ceased to listen, partly because I was already sold, partly because I'd heard the story of slow glass many times before and had never yet understood the principles involved. An acquaintance with scientific training had once tried to be helpful by telling me to visualize a pane of slow glass as a hologram, which didn't need coherent light from a laser for the reconstitution of its visual information, and in which every photon of ordinary light passed through a spiral tunnel coiled outside the radius of capture of each atom in the glass. This gem of, to me, incomprehensibility not only told me nothing, it convinced me once again that a mind as non-technical as mine should concern itself less with causes than effects. The most important effect in the eyes of the average individual was that light took a long time to pass through a sheet of slow glass. A new piece was always jet black, because nothing had yet come through. But one could stand the glass beside, say, a woodland lake, until the scene emerged, perhaps a year later. If the glass was then removed and installed in a dismal city flat, the flat would, for that year, appear to overlook the woodland lake. During the year, it wouldn't be merely a very realistic but still picture. The water would ripple in sunlight, silent animals would come to drink, birds would cross the sky, night would follow day, season would follow season, until one day, a year later, the beauty held in the subatomic pipelines would be exhausted, and the familiar grey cityscape would reappear. Apart from its stupendous novelty value, the commercial success of slow glass was founded on the fact that having a scene dough was the exact emotional equivalent of owning land. The meanest cave dweller could look out on misty parks, and who was to say they weren't his? A man who really owns tailored gardens and estates doesn't spend his time proving his ownership by crawling on his ground, feeling, smelling, tasting it. All he receives from the land are light patterns, and with scene doughs, these patterns could be taken into coal mines, submarines, prison cells. On several occasions, I've tried to write short pieces about the enchanted crystal, but to me the theme is so ineffably poetic as to be, paradoxically, beyond the reach of poetry. Mine, at any rate. Besides, the best songs and verse had already been written, with prescient inspiration, by men who had died long before slow glass was discovered. I had no hope of equalling, for example, Moore, with his "Oft in the stilly night, ere slumber's chains has bound me, fond memory brings the light of other days around me." It took only a few years for slow glass to develop from a scientific curiosity to a sizable industry. And much to the astonishment of us poets, those of us who remain convinced that beauty lives though lilies die, the trappings of that industry were no different from those of any other. There were good scene doughs, which cost a lot of money, and there were inferior scene doughs, which cost rather less. The thickness, measured in years, was an important factor in the cost. But there was also the question of actual thickness, or phase. Even with the most sophisticated engineering techniques available, thickness control was something of a hit-and-miss affair. A coarse discrepancy could mean that a pane, intended to be 5 years thick, might be 5.5, so that light which entered in summer emerged in winter. A fine discrepancy could mean that noon sunshine emerged at midnight. These incompatibilities had their peculiar charm. Many night workers, for example, liked having their own private time zones. But in general, it cost more to buy scendos which kept closely in step with real time. Selina still looked unconvinced when Hagen had finished speaking. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, and I knew he'd been using the wrong approach. Quite suddenly, the pewter helmet of her hair was disturbed by a cool gust of wind, and huge, clean, tumbling drops of rain began to spring round us from an almost cloudless sky. "I'll give you a cheque now," I said abruptly, and saw Selina's green eyes triangulate angrily on my face. "You can arrange delivery." "Oh, aye, delivery's no problem," Hagen said, getting to his feet. But wouldn't you rather take a glass with you?" "Well, yes, if you don't mind." I was shamed by his readiness to trust my scrip. "I'll unclip a pin for you. Wait here, it won't take long to slip it into a carrying frame." Hagen limped down the slope towards the Seriat windows, through some of which the view towards Lynn was sunny, while others were cloudy and a few pure black. Selina drew the collar of her blouse close at the throat. "The least he could have done was invite us inside. Can't be so many fools passing through that he can afford to neglect them." I tried to ignore the insult and concentrated on writing the cheque. One of the outside drops broke across my knuckles, splattering the pink paper. "All right," I said. "Let's move it under the eaves till he gets back." You bitch, I thought, as I felt the whole thing go completely wrong. I just had to be a fool to marry you. A prize fool. A fool's fool. And now that you've trapped part of me inside you, I'll never, ever, never, ever, ever get away. Feeling my stomach clench itself painfully, I ran behind Selina to the side of the cottage. Beyond the window, the neat living room with its coal fire was empty, but child's toys were scattered on the floor. Alphabet blocks and a wheelbarrow the exact colour of freshly pared carrots. As I stared in, the boy came running from the other room and began kicking the blocks. He didn't notice me. A few moments later, the young woman entered the room and, lifting him, laughed easily and wholeheartedly as she swung the boy under her arm. She came to the window as she'd done earlier. I smiled self-consciously, but neither she nor the child responded. My forehead pricked icily. Could they both be blind? I sidled away. Selina gave a little scream and I spun towards her. "The rug," she said, "it's getting soaked." She ran across the yard in the rain, snatched the reddish square from the dappling wall and ran back toward the cottage door. Something heaved convulsively in my subconscious. "Selina!" I shouted. "Don't open it!" But it was too late. She'd pushed open the latched wooden door and was standing, hand over mouth, looking into the cottage. I moved close to her and took the rug from her unresisting fingers. As I was closing the door, I let my eyes traverse the cottage's interior. The neat living room in which I'd just seen the woman and the child was, in reality, a sickening clutter of shabby furniture, old newspapers, cast-off clothing, and smeared dishes. It was damp, stinking, and utterly deserted. The only object I recognized from my view through the window was the little wheelbarrow, paintless and broken. I latched the door firmly and ordered myself to forget what I'd seen. Some men who live alone are good housekeepers. Others just don't know how. Selina's face was white. I don't understand it. "Slow glass works both ways," I said gently. "Light passes out of a house as well as in." "You mean?" "I don't know. It isn't your business. Now, steady up. Hagen's coming back with our glass." The churning in my stomach was beginning to subside. Hagen came into the yard carrying an oblong plastic-covered frame. I held the cheque out to him, but he was staring at Selina's face. He seemed to know immediately that our uncomprehending fingers had rummaged through his soul. Selina avoided his gaze. She was old and ill-looking, and her eyes stared determinedly toward the near horizon. "I'll take the rug from you, Mrs. Garland," Hagan finally said. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself over it." "No trouble. Here's the cheque." "Thank you." He was still looking at Selina with a strange kind of supplication. "It's been a pleasure to do business with you." "The pleasure was mine," I said in equal senseless formality. I picked up the heavy frame and guided Selina toward the path which led to the road. Just as we reached the head of the now slippery steps, Hagan spoke again. "Mr. Garland?" I turned unwillingly. "It wasn't my fault," he said steadily. "A hit-and-run driver got them both, down on the Oban Road 6 years ago. My boy was only 7 when it happened. I'm entitled to keep something." I nodded wordlessly and moved down the path, holding my wife close to me, treasuring the feel of her arms locked around me. At the bend, I looked back through the rain and saw Hagan sitting with squared shoulders on the wall where we'd first seen him. He was looking at the house, but I was unable to tell if there was anyone at the window.